they analyzed it, like it was very probabilistic with the way that they thought about things, like
doing interesting things and asking interesting questions.
Do you happen to remember that question?
I do. I don't think I'm ever going to forget it.
You don't want to solely rely on the evidence. You don't want to solely rely on your prior beliefs. You kind of have to have like a mix of both, if that makes sense. Besides all of that,
then it comes out that gold is worth nothing, but we still use the same, I don't know, it's a terrible analogy, but like the same bartering rules and approach. Like, it just
wanting to model for other people what I've been preaching my whole career. In order to make progress, you have to sort of reach across the aisle and be that kind of person. I think data science and analytics and you know, the group, the community that we're building gives a very structured, a very cohesive way to be able to evolve as a person who's trying to be better at understanding the game.
Welcome to Pardon My Math with Colin Dunphy. This is the last episode of our 6-part series, and I'm thrilled to end it with Eric Eager of Sumer Sports. How are you today, Eric?
Colin, I'm doing great. This is so much fun to be on here with you and get to spend some time and hang out with somebody I've known on Twitter, but haven't really gotten to talk much to. So it's fun.
I really appreciate that. It's great to get to know you better, and you know, I've enjoyed that so much with all our previous guests. So before we get started, I just wanted to give a shout out to all of them. I've learned so much from them during this project, and I hope that everyone watching this episode today will go back to make sure to catch all the others. On each episode, we've tried to connect some of the important lessons about a specific topic of analytics and tie that to an aspect of community, like relationships and friendships. So today's episode will try to tie together some of those points made earlier, especially in regards to community and the human aspect of analytics. So without further ado, Eric, do you have a favorite math fact or piece of trivia you can share with us?
So yeah, I think my favorite one is that Bayes rule, which was named after Reverend Thomas Bayes, who's obviously awesome, but one of the biggest developers of Bayesian statistics is actually Pierre-Simon Laplace, who is actually like my favorite mathematician. If you look at like my old fantasy and DFS like usernames, they are all like Laplace football and stuff, because Laplace is my favorite mathematician. So that's probably it.
Really good. Can you tell us if you remember the first time you remember liking math?
I would say it very much had to do with sports. I was very much a fan of the statistics from like very early on. And yeah, I think that was always kind of it for me. Like I very much wanted to be, I wanted to play sports, but I knew that like the statistics and everything were kind of for me. And so like that was it. Like I was always hooked on math from the likelihood of being able to play sports. And so that was the big one. And then when I got into college, I realized that I was not kind of an NFL caliber athlete, so to speak. And so it really ended up being very much a labor of love for me from a football standpoint. And so I ended up being able to, end up going and get my PhD and kind of getting to sports that way. But it was very much a something I liked through sports. And then once I realized that sports were sort of not for me anymore, it was very much something that like I was a really good backup plan for me.
What was the thought process that led you to writing your book, Football Analytics with Python and R?
I would say for me, it was, one of my good friends, Richard Erickson, was a researcher with me when I was a professor at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. And when that happened, I wrote a lot of papers with him on things like ecology and environmental biology and mathematical biology. And, when I left academia, he and I were still pretty good friends. And what I found was quite interesting was he still wanted to work on papers, but I didn't really have time to dedicate to my like theorems or anything anymore. And so we decided to write the book together. Now, I always say now that it was in response to people messaging me on LinkedIn or messaging me on Twitter or Facebook, people asking me if their nephew could like be an intern for me. And generally speaking, now it's really easy just to send them my book because it ends up being a pretty good summation of kind of like what we're, of what somebody should learn at the very beginning. But it was very much not that way. It was very much initially just two collaborators trying to keep collaborating.
I really enjoyed seeing that Richard Erickson, his name was on some of your previous papers, and to see that, it's the same guy. So that's pretty cool how that relationship brought about that work. I've enjoyed reading and doing the book. It's really rewarding to produce something using code after watching so many and admiring so many people like yourself like doing that. And so I really recommend it. It's my shout out to anyone who's interested in this stuff. A quote that I really liked from the book you used was of John Tukey. I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about who he was, and then before we get into that quote.
Yeah, the quote. So Tukey was just basically, he developed the fast Fourier transform and the box plot. So he was very much a kind of a his early 20th century mathematician and statistician, very popular for popularizing the statistical sciences, which mathematics was kind of like a nobleman's game. It was kind of an affluent game for a long time, a young person's game. Statistics came through and became kind of more of the the way to analyze data, which data was hard to come by. It was hard to store, obviously, before the computer proliferated. And so Tukey kind of, he modernized, not modernized, but he very much popularized exploratory data analysis and things like that. And sort of, was very instrumental in those things.
And here's the quote: "Far better an approximate answer to the right question, which is often vague, than an exact answer to the wrong question, which can always be more precise." Can you explain what that means to you?
Well, we come across this a lot of times with young people who are trying to become mathematicians when, you learn, most of the education nowadays, we're pushing around mathematical symbols all day. We're rationalizing the denominator. We're doing all these kinds of things. And that is, that's less of what math is, right? Like pure mathematics, or less of what applied math is. Pure mathematics is you build an axiom system. That axiom system resembles some sort of structure, hopefully, that you're either seeing in the real world. That's kind of a classical applied math, or it's resembling something that you're using to try to solve a problem in pure math. So like algebraic topology would be an example of like trying to merge two fields together, creating an axiom system that helps you build from that theorems that you can use to make insights about algebra and topology and the number theory and things like that. And I think a lot of times, we don't really understand that the foundations of mathematics are building upon assumptions that we make and coming to conclusions. And the math, while incontrovertible, like 1 + 1 is 2, and it will always be 2, what the one and the other one represent can very much be something that is right or wrong in the context of what you're trying to understand. And so I think that Tukey, what he's talking about is, if you can build an axiom system or a set of model assumptions that are broadly approximating the world that you live in, but are such that you can shoehorn into that framework the correct question, then that's much, much better than having a really well-defined math problem with a good closed form solution that is not answering a question that exists in the real world, or not answering the question that exists in your situation.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I found it was very powerful and made me think a lot. I had to read it over a bunch. And as I'm taking a Coursera class on like data science, I'm just like a learner here. You know, it talked a lot about asking questions, and I felt like that was really kind of in line with that, and it really, I got a lot out of it. And so like the portion of curiosity is what I want to build on. You shared an article about Claire Voisin, who was a mathematician. It says, of course, there are plenty of things to prove, and when you start learning something, you may suffer because of the abstraction. But when you use a theory, because you understand the theorems, you in fact feel very close to the objects in question, even if they are abstract. By learning about the objects, by manipulating them and using them in mathematical arguments, they ultimately become your friend. And so like, I thought that was interesting. We were talking about friends and community and relationships. So I guess the question would be like, what relationship do you think fans should strive to have with data, you know, and theorems and things like that?
Well, I mean, it's like sports are an entertainment business. So I am much less insulted or offended if people don't even want to have a relationship with data with the sports like football. I think that if, you know, and there's some romanticism with me. Like I go back and watch old games. I love the run and shoot. Which I know is like an antiquated offense that really can't win anymore. I know that I'm a big fan of like, you know, big bruising safeties like Steve Atwater. And I know that that's not really a winner in the NFL anymore. And there's a romanticism about football that is different than what I know that wins now. I was a tight end in college. I remember sitting and watching film and being like, oh my gosh, like I'm probably decreasing the likelihood that this play succeeds by being in line than if I'm out in the slot. And if I'm out in the slot, I should just be replaced by a guy who's a better slot receiver than me. So like, how valuable am I right now? And like, that's a good question, right? Like that's a very good question. And so, I think that, that can be tough, right? I think that can be, you know, for people who are not trying to do this professionally, I think that I'm okay with them having any relationship they want to with data. I think that when it comes to people in media or people who are trying to build teams, there's an element of, you know, if a guy owns a football team, he can do whatever he wants with it. So again, I have a very similar idea there. I think for media members, being upfront and being a person who is fluent with data, that understands the context of the data, I think that's important, because I think that the smarter fans get, the more popular the game gets, and the more popular the game gets, obviously, the more opportunities that people have to enjoy their sport. So I can see that part as well. So that's kind of all. That's kind of where I sit on it. Is I certainly think that there's all kinds of places where people can have a relationship with data, and they don't really need to. It doesn't need to be absolutist, in my opinion.
Appreciate that. Yeah. So just this point of curiosity, I think, is really interesting, because like I've been learning about nonviolent communication or compassionate communication, and a big part of that is trying to be curious about why the other person, you know, has the feelings that they're, you know, displaying, and like what needs maybe are like underlying those feelings. So being curious, I think, is like a really important part of communication. And I know when I look at your podcast with Thomas Dimitrov, and I feel like you guys are in a way like modeling nonviolent communication, like very open with each other on like your disagreements and being curious about like each other. And so could you talk a little bit more about, you know, like curiosity, you know, in that relationship that you have with Thomas Dimitrov?
Yeah, I mean, it's 100% like wanting to model for other people what I've been preaching my whole career, which is that in order to make progress, you have to sort of reach across the aisle and be that kind of person, right? It reach across the aisle and ultimately win over people who think differently than you. Now, at Pro Football Focus, where I was, like, we were doing a really good job of meeting the needs of analytics staffers in the NFL, but we weren't exactly meeting the needs of, I would say, the executives in the NFL. And part of the reason for that was that we didn't know any. And so, you can sort of imagine what executives in the NFL believe, but it really does require, I think, it really does require being able to reach across the aisle and kind of see from another person's perspective and kind of where they hold their insecurities and where they hold their what they're trying to get from you. And Thomas is so great in that he certainly wants something out of the relationship, but he's also very caring, and he also cares. He very much wants to see me succeed, and he very much wants me to lean into where my strengths are and build off of those. And that I think makes for obviously a great relationship. And I think that's that's phenomenal, right? I think that's where people you can certainly win in this world. And so that's kind of where I see it. It's very much a product of where we ended up going as far as this company was concerned, and very much where I think most of the advancements in sports analytics are going to take place in the future.
Can you talk about the thought process that went into creating PFF WAR, wins above replacement?
Yeah, it was, very much a thought process of why hasn't anybody done this before? I think a vast majority of the things that I've done in football analytics were born out of that idea. It was like, why hasn't anybody done this before? I had read up, like, one of the first papers I had ever read in football analytics was a paper by James Keener, who interestingly is a mathematical biologist like me. He's more in the physiology, and he had written a paper about basketball and working on basketball. And I thought that, this is quite interesting. And yeah, I always thought that he did a good job with team strengths. And if I could take that information with PFF grades, I eventually moved off of the Keener method and went to more the Massey method. Once that happened, I was able to build a way to simulate with and without players. And then over time, it was just iterating off of what teams had told me based upon sort of what I was learning, what I was learning from the team. So it was a very good way to start a career. And I thought that it was, I didn't, with anything with research, like, I feel like you don't think it's as big of a deal when you do it as it ends up being. And it's taken shape quite a bit better than I thought it would. But I thought it was going to be a small contribution. It ended up being a pretty big one.
I love how it ties together so much of the things that we've been talking about, sometimes like directly and sometimes tangentially, as it relates to the topics of this series. So I thought it might be fun to kind of just suss that out. So can you describe maybe, as what you think maybe the relationship may or may not be between WAR and EPA?
Well, directly, not much at this point, other than EPA is sort of like what EPA ties into winning games, and WAR is using as whether or not you win games, the response variable. I think that there are going to be more like play for play WAR models that are a little bit more tied to EPA. But the PFF version of it is obviously correlated with EPA, and it does better, I think, at predicting EPA 1 year than EPA does. But it's not actually tied specifically to it. It's actually more of a much more broader team-based model, which is has to do with like point differential, which is and a manifestation of EPA and things of that ilk. And strength of schedule, which is a big deal.
That was our first episode with Tage. Our second episode was with Ben Alamar. We went into analytics, and we touched on QBR. So can you say how you think it might relate, WAR might relate to QBR? Maybe something different.
I think QBR is, ESPN underneath the hood does a decent amount of their own charting, which I think most people don't know that. And so I think that to me, it's there's a very close connection between process and outcome there. Whereas if you throw an interceptable pass, QBR might ding you, and same thing with Pro Football Focus grades. So I think in that respect, I think PFF grades are maybe for quarterback a little bit less tied to outcomes than QBR is, but I think that they're both trying to get at that process level idea there.
Now, episode 3, we talked about success rate, also explosive play rate with Arjun Menon. Can you talk about what you think might be there?
Yeah, I mean, explosive play rate's huge, right? Because in the current NFL, the defenses have figured out a long time ago that they're not necessarily good enough to stop offenses and create 3 and outs. What they're good at is making the offense cross the street a million times on the way to the end zone, right? And forcing a mistake. The way to get away from making mistakes is making big plays. And so, a 40-yard run means you overcome the necessity to cross the street a few times without being hit by a car. You can just jump over the street, right? That's kind of the way I see it. So explosive plays are so big from that perspective that it just basically takes away one of the mechanisms that defenses have been able to use to stop offenses over the past few years.
And does WAR do a good job of kind of pulling both of those success rate and explosive play rate into one concept, or?
WAR does an okay job in that, explosive plays are graded higher by PFF, but it also does a good job of curbing explosive play noise because explosive plays are not that stable on the player level, right? So, 20-yard passes by quarterbacks are not that stable, so on and so forth. So that I think WAR does a better job. EPA, I think you have to kind of match together EPA and success rate in order to make that work. Because success rate's kind of more of the play for play. Are you generating positivity for your offense? It's not going to kill you for a pick 6, which is just one play out of 55 or 60 in a game. It's not going to say you're the best in the world for 2 big plays, which again are 1/30th of your game. But those plays are probably going to determine whether or not you win or lose. So.
Now, in episode 4, we talked about the intersection of EPA and grading with Amelia Probst. So what do you think relationship might be there between WAR with that?
Well, grading is what builds WAR. I think almost any team that's building out a WAR model or a value model is using their scouting grades to an extent. So that connection is going to be pretty sizable. And EPA and grades, they're going to be somewhat correlated, but not perfectly so, right? If a quarterback throws an interceptable ball and it gets dropped, that goes from a 4-point play to the defense to maybe a half a point play to the defense. That's 3.5 points that the quarterback really didn't generate, even though post throw it was something that happened. So it's going to be reflected, but not completely so. And that's why. There's many different ways to skin the cat here because there are multiple different ways to measure all these things.
And how about WAR and trade value charts? We talked about those with Brad Spielberger in our last episode.
Yeah, trade value charts are going to be different depending upon your point of view. If you're the Carolina Panthers and you have Derek Brown, and Derek Brown for the first 2 years of his career was kind of a replacement level player, maybe a little bit better, you're not necessarily going to see, if you drafted him for the purposes of him contributing right away, then you're not going to see that pick as much of a success as if you drafted him to be a cornerstone player on your franchise, which is sort of where Spielberger and Fitzgerald sort of win with their draft chart, which is what their second contract APY is. And so from the perspective of measurement there, it really just depends upon what you value, which is kind of hard because in some cases you value those two different things different times.
How about WAR and storytelling? So that's kind of what we're trying to, I think, build in today is the stories that we tell and communities. And so how do you think WAR might relate to that?
Well, I think you're more able to capture the player's contribution to the team, meaning WAR is going to tell you, okay, this is a 5-win player. Eli Manning in 2011 was a 5-win player. Most of his career, he was never more than a 2.5-win player. So he was twice as valuable in the one Super Bowl season. Everybody thinks that Eli was kind of carried by the Giants and their defense. But in the 2011 season, he was the one that carried that team to a Super Bowl. They were not a very good team that had a negative point differential. And Eli Manning was really the star on that football team. And, to have that kind of context is super important.
Zooming out from not just WAR, but like analytics as a whole in the context of storytelling. Can you just elaborate on that? What should fans maybe think about in terms of data science principles, as they set out to tell their own stories?
Well, I just think that you have to go back and do the research that's happened before you. I think that it's awesome to do your own work and to discover things, and then you have to do your own research. Like, I think a thing that I really like to do is I like to go back and read old newspaper clippings. I like to go back and look at the context upon which I'm seeing statistics. I look back at like I said, I love the run and shoot. Like, why was Warren Moon a guy that threw a lot of interceptions? Why was he a guy that only won half of his starts, and yet he's in the Hall of Fame? You watch his games, it's unmistakable how good he was. But there was always something a little bit left behind. Why was Randall Cunningham a player who, many thought was a Hall of Fame caliber player, but his team never won more than 11 games in Philadelphia, and he never won a playoff game there until 1992, and that was the only playoff game he won as the Eagles starting quarterback. Well, you look back and his sack rate was like the league leading sack rate during that time. And so while he was a great passer and a great runner, he wasn't like engineering the best offense in the NFL despite his talents, because there was that one thing hidden in the data. Like, I think for people, curiosity is huge, and you just build upon it in a way in which you're comfortable and accustomed.
I love how you touched on curiosity there. A big part of this whole project for me has been to have, learn something from someone like yourself or Tej, and then, set out to try and learn more. I might develop a relationship with someone along the way and learn something else, and then the cycle continues. So like, that was a kind of a theme that I'm hoping viewers of this series will take away. We're going to zoom through some of these next slides. There's evolution of the pressure to sack rate that, you've had a big part in the creation of it. And I want to encourage, viewers at home to reach out to you or read your work to understand more about this stuff. You did really cool work on the coaching value. I thought was awesome. And you did this, your doctorate work, I understand I saw, was in creating a research experience for undergraduate. I thought that was so interesting, and how that, it seemed like your work in mentoring, Amelia Probst mentioned in our episode 4, you were a really big mentor for her, and how much she really appreciated, your relationship. So, I think that's just awesome. I wanted to commend you for that. A big part of this series has been, for me to talk about Joseph Campbell and like following your bliss, and like how that might, open up opportunities for community. With the purpose of mythology that Joseph Campbell was talking about is like, how can we use mythology to act humanly in in the system without trying necessarily to change the system. Here we have this quote from John Tukey who says, what they needed was not a biostatistician, they needed a philosopher of experiments and surveys. So yeah, can you explain how fans again should maybe try and use analytics in a decent way?
Yeah, I mean, I think analytics gives one a better fighting chance in having a consistent worldview about the sport. It gives them a consistent way in which to change opinions. I think so much, and I like a lot of people in our little universe here. So I don't mean to disparage anybody, certainly, but I think that a lot of times in the content space, people have an opinion, and that's their currency, and they have to hold dear to it, even though it's a losing bet, right? Like I said after Chiefs training camp in 2022 that I didn't think Isaiah Pacheco was very good. I was very clearly wrong. I got off that opinion in November, and I've been able to enjoy my favorite team winning 2 straight Super Bowls. That's a consistent. If I'm like, well, why did you change your opinion? Well, when the data changed, I changed my mind. For people who have opinions based upon what they see and that certainly has value, but there's less of a cohesive way for them to change their mind, to change their philosophy on things. And I think it makes it harder to be a well-grounded analyst. And so I think data science and analytics and the group, the community that we're building gives a very structured, a very cohesive way to be able to evolve as a person who's trying to be better at understanding the game.
I love the way you say that. Thank you again for your participation in this. Can you tell fans how they can try and reach out to you or follow you at Sumer Sports?
Yeah, at Eric Eager _ on all the social stuff. At Sumer Sports is where the company that myself and Tej work at. It's a lot of fun every single day. Until 10 years ago or so, it was only accessible to certain people. And now I think that because of analytics, because of some of the intentional things that a few people have done, Michael Lopez in the NFL, who deserves a great deal of credit for the Big Data Bowl, but also just his heart for a lot of this stuff. I think that the NFL is much more accessible to many more people, and that's going to make it more popular, which means obviously there's going to be more opportunities, and those things just snowball. I think about the growth in sports in general, and it makes me very happy to be a small part of it. So I'm thank you for having me on, and it's fun to talk math. It's fun to talk philosophy and football.
Thank you, Eric. I really do appreciate it. And we'll close it there. Thank you very much.